The ocean stretched endlessly, gray and cold, swallowing every sound except the soft hum of the submarine's engines. My grandfather's voice came back to me as I imagined that moment, quiet but tense. War makes everything black and white, until you see a little gray floating in the middle of the sea. He said it like it was a lesson, not a memory, but I think that's exactly what it was. They were patrolling the North Atlantic. The deck of the U-boat slick with salt spray, eyes scanning the horizon. It was early morning. The kind of light that made shadows long and soft. And the crew had already grown used to the constant hum of danger. Every sighting could be a torpedo threat, a convoy to attack, a life to take. They were trained to see enemies everywhere. Trained to kill first and think later. That's what made the next few moments so strange, so heavy, so impossible to forget. 3 figures appeared on the water, bobbing like fragile toys on a raft. Not a ship, not an armed vessel, just 3 men clinging to a piece of wood, drifting. My grandfather paused every time he told the story at that point. Like he was letting me feel the same silence that had fallen over the crew that morning. The men were Russians, he said. Probably survivors from a sunken ship. Probably exhausted, terrified, and completely at the mercy of the world around them. The crew didn't speak at first. They just stared. You could imagine the calculations running through their minds. They could fire the deck gun, clear the threat, remove a potential enemy. It would have been simple. Quick. Professional. The kind of thing they had been trained to do so many times. Yet, no one moved. The rifles rested against their shoulders, the barrels pointing at nothing in particular. The deck gun remained silent. Even the sonar operator seemed distracted. His eyes wide as though he'd seen something that didn't fit the rules of war. My grandfather always said that's when he noticed the first hesitation. Not in himself, not in anyone, but in the air. Hesitation is contagious, he explained. Once it starts in one mind, it spreads. You can feel it in the rhythm of the ship. In the silence between commands. In the way people breathe slower and lean back without realizing it. Hesitation is dangerous in war. It's weakness. But it's also unmistakably human. They watched those 3 Russians for what felt like hours. Not the kind of hours that pass quietly. Every wave that lifted the raft, every shift of the men's bodies, made the crew wonder. What were they thinking? Were they armed? Could they call for help? But as the minutes passed, the answer became painfully obvious. They weren't soldiers in formation. They weren't a threat, they weren't even capable of defending themselves. They were just people. The youngest on the raft had a head full of wet hair plastered to his forehead. The oldest leaned forward, holding the center post of the raft, rocking slightly, as if afraid to fall off. The third man's arm hung over the edge, his hand trailing in the cold water. They didn't wave. They didn't shout. They didn't even look at the submarine in the way an enemy might. They looked exhausted. Human. Fragile. And then something remarkable happened. The Germans began to talk. Not loudly, not angrily, not to give orders. But quietly, almost as if to themselves. Some asked each other what they were seeing. Some said nothing at all. My grandfather said the tension was almost unbearable. Because everyone was thinking the same thing but no one wanted to say it out loud. Can we really fire on them? Can we really end 3 lives that aren't threatening us in the least? It's hard to imagine the morality of that decision if you've never been in that moment. War simplifies morality on paper. Enemy is enemy. Kill or be killed. But it doesn't simplify the heart. My grandfather explained it wasn't pity or sentimentality. It was recognition. They were looking at men who could have been their brothers if circumstances were different. They were looking at humans stripped of armor, stripped of pride, stripped of war. In that recognition, the sharp lines of orders and duty began to blur into something else. Conscience. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the sea into a sheet of blinding silver. The Germans continued to follow the raft, keeping a safe distance, watching, waiting. Some of the younger sailors laughed nervously, trying to break the silence. Some whispered to one another about how strange it was to see men alive when they expected enemies to die. My grandfather remembered one old sailor muttering, "They're just floating, just alive, what are we doing?" That question, so simple, echoed across the deck and into the minds of everyone aboard. By the time the sun started dipping toward the horizon, the 3 Russians had drifted closer to a patch of debris, where some driftwood and a broken crate offered a tiny bit of shelter. The Germans still didn't fire. They followed at a distance, maintaining the illusion of potential threat, but the decision had already been made silently. No one wanted to be the first to break the chain of hesitation. No one wanted to speak the word that might justify what they all felt. That these were no longer enemies. That they couldn't be. It was a quiet, strange kind of victory for the human spirit. My grandfather said he had never seen anything like it before, and he never would again. For 4 days. Perhaps, he told me later, the crew might have woken each morning expecting to shoot. But every morning they saw those same 3 men, and every morning, they didn't. And in that repeated choice not to act, something remarkable happened. The submarine crew felt themselves change. They weren't just soldiers following orders. They were witnesses. They were humans making a choice. They were aware of the weight of life in a way that training, rules, or loyalty could never teach. When the raft finally drifted out of their range, the Germans watched silently as the 3 survivors disappeared into the horizon. Nobody spoke. The radio operator didn't even turn the dial. My grandfather remembered feeling a strange emptiness mixed with relief. The kind you feel when you've seen a miracle you weren't supposed to see. It wasn't a victory, not really. It wasn't a moral badge or a heroic act. It was a pause. A quiet acknowledgement that life could exist even in the most brutal places. And that sometimes the hardest thing to do in war is the right thing. He never said if the Russians ever knew they had been spared. He didn't care. The lesson wasn't theirs to learn. It was his and the crew's. That small hesitation, that tiny moment of mercy, had imprinted itself on their lives in ways that battles never could. Because in those minutes, those hours, those days of watching and waiting, the Germans realized something undeniable. War doesn't erase humanity. It tests it. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage isn't in killing, but in choosing not to. When I think about that story now, I understand exactly what he meant when he said the sea was gray. Not black and white, not enemy and friend, not kill or survive. Gray. Where every choice matters. Where hesitation can save lives, where conscience has a louder voice than orders. That day on the Atlantic, 3 Russians on a raft became a mirror, showing my grandfather and the entire submarine crew a truth that no weapon could teach. Even in war, humanity has the power to endure. It's a lesson that stayed with him for the rest of his life. And even now, as I tell it, it's almost impossible to forget. Because the silence, the hesitation, the quiet act of mercy, that is the kind of story that doesn't just linger in history books. It lingers in the mind, in the heart, in the moments when we have to ask ourselves what kind of person we want to be when faced with life, death, and the choice in between.